British time, not the Israeli version of it, in which 1 hour lasts at least 80 minutes. So it's been a century since Lord Balfour sat to his desk and dictated to his secretary the unforgotten letter starting with the words, His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. And we would like to open up this roundtable to discuss the question, what has happened to the Israeli-British relationship since then? And what is the future waiting for us? And I would like to invite the participants, Knesset member Hilik Bar, Yechiel Bar, but we know him as Hilik, the co-chair of the Israel-United Kingdom Parliamentary Friendship Group, Lord Pollack, the honorary president of the Conservative Friends of Israel, John Ryan, parliament member from the Labour and the parliamentary chair of the Labour Friends of Israel, Daniel Kau, the former ambassador of Israel to the United Kingdom, and the author and columnist Melanie Phillips. And I would like to open up this discussion with one question fits all, if I may. 100 years on, is Britain still an actor in the Middle East? Does it still have a special relationship with the Jewish people and the Jewish state?
So, thank you, Amit. So the question is Britain still an actor on the international stage in the Middle East? And I think that probably has to divide into two. It's, does Britain have the capacity, and does Britain have the will? I think in terms of the capacity, Britain is still a remarkable player on the international stage. According to some surveys, it's defined perhaps not as a superpower, but as a global power. It's in the Permanent Five, it's in the G7, obviously financial center, and so on and so forth. Really tremendously significant potential, and obviously people talk a lot about soft power, and it's tangible. Just think about the way that Israelis relate to the United Kingdom in a way that they relate differently to almost any other country outside the United States. But then there is the question about whether Britain has the will to be a player on the international stage. And here I have to say, in the time that I've been watching, that will seems to have been waning. I think a very seminal moment was when Prime Minister David Cameron tried to persuade the British Parliament to authorize the use of force in Syria when Syria crossed the red line, which really seemed to express a failure of will to use force in almost any circumstance. We see it in Brexit, obviously, which we may talk about. We see it in the fact that so few British news outlets actually have a foreign bureau anymore. And there's a lack of interest. I think I must have listened to almost every party leader's speech in the last 8 years. And with the single exception of Jeremy Corbyn in the last Labour Party conference, I don't think I ever heard a single one make a reference to an issue of foreign policy, which to me sends a signal that Britain is losing its interest in playing a role on the international stage. And I just want to say personally that I view that with some sadness. I actually think Britain has a tremendous contribution to make, not just as a friend of Israel, but in all sorts of ways. And so again, the answer to your question, I would say the capacity is there, but I think there's a question mark over the will.
Please.
Well, I think the relationship between Britain and Israel is incredibly important, and recent polling in the UK would indicate that the population have the same view. there's been recent polling around because of the Balfour Declaration Centenary, and it's in fact very positive about Britain's view, or British people's view, of Israel. And we have a very strong relationship with Israel. I think the trading relationship is an indication of this, and I think our relationship with regards to things like national security and policing and counter-terrorism is also an indication. I know the Mayor for London, Sadiq Khan, has been consulting with Israel on counter-terrorism. So that relationship is very important in the UK. I'm sure we'll come to questions a little later about how the Labour Party may or may not view that, so I won't dip into that at the moment. I think in terms of the wider Middle East, I think I would agree with much of what Daniel has said. However, when it came to voting for airstrikes, both in Iraq and in Syria, the next time, the Parliament very clearly voted for them. I do think it was a seminal moment when we didn't vote to go into to take action in Syria the first time, and I think there's been a lot of lessons learned and some regret, but not in a uniform way certainly across the Labour Party, and that's an issue. I think our position on the quartet will be lost, I think, if we when we leave the European Union. So that could be a reduction in influence, and what that will mean in future for our position on the UN Security Council, I think could be called into question when we're no longer a part of that huge EU bloc. Often we think we punch above our weight being there on the UN Security Council as a permanent member, and given the influence and the soft power that we do have. So I think we are in a period of time when the next couple of years in many, many ways are going to be very crucial for our country and possibly bring very big changes, some of which may well be very unwelcome.
Well, I mean, to your question, if the UK is involved in the Middle East today, it's between no to not enough. I mean, from conflict-wide, I mean, economically, of course. Israel, I think that England is the biggest state that we export our goods to. But if you're talking about the Middle East, as you meant, no, it used to be very much involved. This is why we're sitting here, because of what happened, lucky for us, 100 years ago. But it's not involved enough. But I don't agree fully with Daniel that they don't have the will. Because I thought so, but since I was acting as the chairperson of the parliamentary group between the Israel and the UK, and I'm grateful for that, I discovered that there is a huge will in both the Labour side and in the Conservative side to be involved in what's going on inside Israel, but also to be involved on peace issue, on solving the conflict. I attended numerous events of the LFI, which is chaired by John, that dealt with the two-state solution, with how it will be better here for Israel. By the way, from an Israeli perspective, what should they do in order to have a better Israel, a stronger Israel? And I'm
not only in terms of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
No, not just. But again, when you're talking about involving the Middle East, I assume that you mean that how do we fit better in the Middle East? Again, if it's economic ties, I guess that the UK is involved. So I discovered a huge amount of will. I'm having, and you know what, it's not only with the officials, with the parliament member, I'm having a lot of family. In the UK, my grandmother made Aliyah from Liverpool in the 50s. You cannot hear it from my English, but
We have more
some of my family has better English. And my family, you know, half of them belong to the Labour, like me. I'm a Labourite here in Israel. Some of them belong to the Tories. Nobody's perfect, you know. But one of my family is a very famous Tory, you know. Both of them agree that Israel is important, and the Middle East, the neighborhood, which is neighboring to Europe, is very important. Now, as one who had a lot of ties with the Labour, I guess that your chairman, Jeremy Corbyn, also have a lot of friends in the Middle East, just not the right one. Just not the right one. Dear friends, not the right one. But it means that wherever you are, in the very left of the Labour or in the very far right among the conservative, you care about Israel, you care about the Middle East. You ask me if we take advantage of that fact as Israel? No, not enough.
Well, being a proud Scouser, Liverpudlian, clearly Hillik, you're one of our better exports. To answer the question, I think I'm going to quote something that the British Prime Minister said the other day, where in the dinner that Lord Rothschild kindly hosted, in her speech, she talked about following and working together with the American administration on their efforts to bring the two sides closer together. And I think that the position of the United Kingdom is one that should be working together with the United States of America rather than possibly finding our own initiatives, which I think will probably be a mistake. So working together with the United States, I think, is the way forward. And I think there's a willingness to do that. We have a diplomatic corps across the world which are second to none, including here in Israel. But I think working in partnership with the United States is the way for us to go.
Well, for the foreseeable future, certainly for the next few years, Britain has one foreign preoccupation overall, and that's Brexit. And it's in fact a domestic preoccupation, and it's consuming it, and it will consume it for the foreseeable future. And so it's not even running its own affairs properly at the moment, let alone thinking about anyone else's affairs. In terms of the relationship that Britain has with Israel...
You want to end the European mandate over the UK?
Yes, I did.
You can take some advices from us.
Yes, well... in terms of the relationship that Britain has with Israel, I think nothing much has changed actually since 1917. It remains deeply ambivalent towards the idea of the Jewish people in their ancestral homeland. And the attitudes, I think, can't be easily corralled into one statement, because different sections of the British population have very different approaches. First of all, you have, at government level, you have the defence and intelligence arms of Great Britain, which, as far as I can see, are intimately involved with their Israeli counterparts and have a relationship of enormous strength in common, making common cause against common enemies, and with deep, deep ties. And I don't think that's going to change anytime soon, because the threats that both countries face quite obviously are going to increase. And so that relationship, I would expect, is going to develop very much in the next few years. When it comes to the government, however, when it comes to the kind of political echelon, as it were, again, then I think you find a great deal of ambivalence. I think the current Prime Minister, Mrs. May, is remarkably, for a British politician, devoid of any animus at all against the Jewish people or the State of Israel. I think she is a genuine friend of the Jewish people and of the State of Israel, and that is unusual, and it's very much to be welcomed. But even so, Mrs. May is, like all Prime Ministers, the prisoner to a certain extent of a set of political attitudes which go back a very long way. And we saw this expressed in the ambivalence with which the British government responded to the Balfour Declaration Centenary. On the one hand, it was fulsome in its enthusiasm for Britain's role in the Balfour Declaration. Mrs. May and others have said repeatedly they are extremely proud of the role that they played and of creating the State of Israel, which remains a great friend. And in the next breath, they then go on to misrepresent the words of the Balfour Declaration by saying that the second part of the Balfour Declaration, the famous phrase which said that nothing should be done to jeopardize the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, that second half has not been fully implemented. It is still unfinished business. What is that unfinished business? The answer is there is no unfinished business. That second half has been delivered to the letter. The non-Jewish communities in Israel, their rights are guaranteed to an extent to which their civil and religious rights are guaranteed, to an extent which is not the case in any other country in the Middle East. What is being referred to is political rights. And political rights were very deliberately omitted from the Balfour Declaration because political rights would have opened up the can of worms that there were two rival nationalisms, which in the view of the British government at the time, there were not. The Balfour Declaration commitment was to a Jewish home alone because the government of the day, the politicians of the day believed it was the Jews alone who had the historic, moral and everlasting legal right to re-establish their home in Palestine, because it was the re-establishment of their home, because the Jewish people are the only people for whom the land of Israel was ever their national kingdom. And so, for the British government to say there's unfinished business, and then for some of them to actually spell it out, the unfinished business of the state of Palestine, is a lie. And they had no need to say it, and it was unpleasant that they did say it. Whether or not one thinks there should be a state of Palestine is another issue. But to say that that was implicit in the Balfour Declaration is simply untrue. So it pains me greatly to hear Britain, on the one hand, genuinely saying at government level that they are proud of their role in helping create the State of Israel, or helping start the process which created the State of Israel, brackets, they don't say what followed from the Balfour Declaration, which is another story which perhaps we might come on to. But it's a great tragedy to me that they are so ambivalent. And that leads me to my final point, which is that what a missed opportunity this was in Britain, because this anniversary of the Balfour Declaration could have been used as the opportunity, especially with a very pro-Israel Prime Minister, to start teaching the British public some facts of life about Israel, because so many people in Britain haven't got the faintest idea about the truths of Middle East history and of the Jewish claim to the land, and they have no idea in particular that the Jewish claim to the land is not based on emotion. It's not based on the fact that the Europeans felt badly about what had been done to the Jews in the Holocaust. It's based on law. Everything Israel does is in accordance with law. It is based on historic right. And this was an opportunity for the British government to put the public and the British media right about these truths which are never told, and to say that the lies that are told about Israel have now got to stop. And unfortunately, that opportunity has not been taken, and unfortunately, the media and large swathes of the public, I'm afraid, remain in this state of very unfortunate ignorance.
That brings us exactly to the next stage. 7 years ago, when I lived in the UK, I covered for Channel 2 News, the late Channel 2 News, who died last week, may he rest in peace, a protest a day after the Marmara flotilla in front of the Israeli embassy in Kensington. And I saw two signs. The protesters actually hit two Jewish women, but this is not the story. The story was about two signs I saw. One of the LGBT community of Shoreditch, protests against the Israeli occupation of Gaza, and the second was Hezbollah flag, the yellow one. And I thought to myself that the only place on earth in which lesbian women from Shoreditch and a Hezbollah supporter from Lebanon can meet is just in front of the Israeli embassy in London. So I would like to ask you, Ryan, how do you explain the fact that UK and London are the hub of the anti-Israeli, anti-Semitic activity in Europe? What happened?
So London is called, and probably rightly so, the BDS capital of the world. I don't think, you see, this, I mean, especially if I look within the Labour Party, this whole view that we are, you know, that there is this huge anti-Israel feeling, I don't think that's actually describes the situation myself. You find the kind of hard left version of that, I suppose, on some university campuses, among some student groups, and obviously there are other groups who, many of whom have infiltrated the Labour Party, who hold such views. But the general public, I don't think, hold those views. I don't think it's overwhelmingly against some of these kind of demands for BDS, you know, for boycotts, etc. But at least half of the population, if not more, are not in favour of boycotting Israel. So I don't think it's quite as straightforward to say, you know, this is what's going on in the UK, because I don't think that is what's going on in the UK. No more than I think it's entirely the story of what's happening in the Labour Party. There has, since the 1970s, been this hard left rhetoric, this ideological hard left approach that Zionism is wrong, that these are the bad guys and the good guys are being displaced and suffering.
Because the weaker you are, the stronger you are, or because is the fault?
No, but there's a kind of victim mentality, isn't there? That because you've got to create the good guys and the bad guys, it's got to be pretty simple. So there's this big focus at the moment on the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And there is a humanitarian situation in Gaza, and nobody is denying that. But it's what is the cause of it and what can we do about it? It's not solving the problem to have this rhetoric that Israel is the representative of all that is wrong with imperialism and capitalism, and therefore they are the enemy. They're like taken by these hard left groups as the symbol of imperialism, and therefore it is right to be against them. But I think it's quite a small minority of people who think that.
Which includes, by the way, the chairman of your party.
The lead, we don't call him the chairman, that's...
The leader.
I think that was Chairman Mao, wasn't it? No, we don't call him chairman.
In Hebrew it sounds better.
He's the leader of the Labour Party, and he holds different views to my own. He holds some particular views. I don't feel I can speak for him, but he has always been more of a partisan on the Palestinian side of the argument, should we say. Labour Friends of Israel is not Labour enemies of Palestine. We absolutely believe in a two-state solution. We want to see a Palestinian state. We think that's extremely important. That's what will give Israel its security that it deserves and should have.
Just to say something interesting, 50 years ago, you know that one of Jerusalem's most famous monuments, the menorah statue just in front of the Knesset, was donated by the Labour Party to the Israeli parliament. So I'd just like to ask you whether you think Mr. Corbyn will donate another statue to the Zionist
Well,
state.
from the other side of the aisle, I have never spoken to Jeremy Corbyn. He probably wouldn't want to speak to me. But I think he probably is very genuine in what he believes. I think he believes in everything, and he's worked for 30 years. The fact that he's probably wrong on every issue is irrelevant. But I want to agree with something that Melanie said, because actually it's about ignorance. Now, all the people in this room, all of us are with our spectacles on, we're looking at everything to do with Israel and the Jewish community, and this is happening. Majority of people in Britain probably think that Israel's somewhere south of Afghanistan, has no clue. And sometimes we forget that. And that includes many members of parliament. And there is a silent majority, and this is the problem. There is a silent majority, which I think is very supportive, but they don't feel confident enough to speak up. And I know this in the House of Lords. I mean, people don't speak up. They think there's the ex-permanent secretary here and there's this one there. I can't possibly speak up. And last summer there was a debate called by a member of the Lords on the health and of the children of Gaza. And it's the etiquette is that whoever puts the debate, at the end of the debate, thanks all the members, all the other members of the Lords who took part. This particular time, he said, I'd like to thank almost all the Lords, because he was then referring to me, who gave a slightly different view on the health of the children in the Gaza, where I blamed Hamas and so on. But after the debate, a particular member of the Lords came up to me and said, Stuart, she said, nobody's introduced us. I'm Jenny. I said, Baroness Tong. She said to me about my speech, she said, that was a good effort. And I didn't take the condescending tone, and I just said, I thought he was a bit better than that. And we sat down, and she said to me, Stuart, I want you to know something. I said, what's that? She said, for many, many years, I've always been a great friend of Israel. I'm telling you the truth. And I looked at her and I said, well, if you don't mind me saying it, you have a very funny way of showing it. And then she said, well, your people, and this is where it's all about ignorance on both sides. She goes, your people have taken somebody else's land. That was the lie. I dealt with the your people and told her I was as British as she was, even though I'm from Liverpool. I told her that. But then, the minute you give facts, they struggle. So I said to her, I asked her a question. I said, when was the PLO formed? And she looked at me. I said, well, look, I'll help you. I said, it was in 1964. So I said, tell me, who had control of Gaza in 64? And she looked at me again, and we worked it out, Egypt. I said, and who had control of the West Bank? And she said, Jordan. So I said, well, tell me, what did the liberation part of the Palestinian Liberation Organization refer to? And then she looked at me and said, well, I've never thought about that. So actually, it's Melanie's point. It's education, and somehow or other, with today's modern age of internet and Twitter and Instagram, we're going to have to be much cleverer and find how we can educate people in a much better way.
After you, Claude.
Obviously, education is absolutely critical, and I really want to pay tribute to Stuart and Joan and CFI and LFI, who have done absolutely extraordinary work bringing politicians and up-and-coming politicians to see the reality of Israel. But I think we're fooling ourselves if we think that education is the entire issue. There's a wonderful saying amongst diplomats which is you can change my opinion, but you can't change my instructions. And so you really need to know how far you can go. And I think with the far left, we're talking about an issue of identity, and that there is a limit to how much the facts can actually shift people from their positions. I mean, the experience that you had, Amit, is the same experience that I would have at every university I would go and speak at, where there would be demonstrators from this bizarre coalition of what used to be called the Red-Green Alliance, radical leftists and radical Islamists, who would campaign together. And to break up that coalition is very easy in theory. You just say, I know what it is that you're against. Tell me what it is that you're for. Are you in favor of women's rights? Are you in favor of gay rights? Are you in favor of a free press? And so on. But the fact is, and the truth of it is, that Baroness Carton, even after that conversation, is in the same place as she was before. And we have to recognize that education is critical for the next generation. But for this generation, we're talking about a situation where the facts of Israel, maybe we are the contours of the screen, but what is being projected onto that screen comes from the internal identity of extremists who are looking to be anti-colonial, anti-American, anti-Blair.
Or post-colonial hangover, as the former foreign minister of Israel used to phrase the coin.
Okay, so maybe all of those things. And that creates a very unusual and difficult dilemma for Israel, for Israeli diplomacy, which is our fallback position, and it's the correct position, is to be entirely bipartisan in our dealings with a foreign country. And the fact is, in the UK, Melanie, it's not so unusual to have such a friendly Prime Minister as Theresa May. We've had 6 of them in a row, including 2 of them from the Labour Party, who are instinctively sympathetic to Jews and to Israel. But now we're talking about a place where that is coming into jeopardy. And what does that mean for the nature of the relationship that we develop or think about developing with a party which could possibly cross the bounds of what today have been, very established red lines? It's an answer that really needs some serious thinking about, because it's one that we haven't had to face in the UK for a very long time.
Well, I very much agree with what Daniel has just said. But the question was, why is the United Kingdom the hub of all this? Why is it the centre of this terrible contagion? And it is. And I think that's a very interesting question. And I think the first thing to say is that, again, one can't easily make, or one shouldn't make, sweeping generalisations, because Britain is not one homogeneous unit. I think there is a great distinction when it comes to attitudes to Israel between what I would call the metropolitan intelligentsia and the less educated people and people who live in rural communities. And I think there's a difference in attitudes between them, which is very striking, and we saw that, in fact, in the vote for Brexit. I'm sorry to refer to Brexit twice in one afternoon, but it's very much on my mind. What I find is that this distinction, when it comes to Israel, is absolutely crucial. In my view, the animus and malice towards Israel, which is on such terrible show, is absolutely correlated with education and social class. The higher up the educational scale you go, the more horrible and malicious and ignorant and bigoted people are about Israel. The lower down the social scale you go, the more decent and sensible and reasonable they are.
So
and
not necessarily,
that,
education will only worsen the situation.
Well, it's unfortunately it's the case. You take somebody who's reasonably ignorant and you send them to a good university and they come back hating Jews in Israel. That's basically what's happening at the moment. Now, why is that? Well, because in Britain, the discourse of anti-Israelism, which is part of the discourse of anti-colonialism, in which basically the countries and peoples of the developing world can do no wrong, and the developing world can do no right because the developing world basically ruled over and oppressed the developed world ruled over and oppressed the developing world. That framing is crucial when it comes to the attitudes to Israel. They are part of the same story. And so the Jews, for these purposes, are not considered to be minorities, ridiculous as that may sound. Even in countries like Britain, where, you know, identifying Jews are what now, 260,000 out of a population of some 63 million. The Jews are not considered a minority because in the current interpretation of the word minority, a minority is only a minority if it has no power. And we all know the Jews not only have power, they run everything. And that's the view. So the Jews cannot be victims ever. The Jews of Israel cannot be victims ever, because the Jews of Israel, first of all, they're Jews and they run the world, and as we all know, they run basically American foreign policy. I mean, this is common discourse in Britain, and also they're armed to the teeth by America, so they cannot be victims. So you've got that whole frame of thinking. Now, that frame of thinking, which is basically anti-colonialist, to use shorthand, has become the default position on the left. It's not just the hard left. I'm sorry, the Labour Party cannot get away with this. It's not all Jeremy Corbyn. This preceded Jeremy Corbyn. This is the default position among progressive people, that the Jews of Israel are the oppressors, they're the rogue state in the region, they behave illegitimately, they have no right basically to be there, and that the Palestinians are entirely their victims and are entirely blameless. That is basically the default position in progressive thinking generally in Britain. Now, why is it taken over? Because, unlike, say, in America, in my view, there was no proper pushback against this way of thinking. This way of thinking colonized thinking people to an extent which didn't happen in America. In America, you had culture wars. You have a battle between 2 points of view, basically the coasts versus the middle red states. And the reason for that, I believe, is because of the role played in America and Britain, the different roles played by religion. Religion in America, there are a lot of religious people in America who basically subscribe to traditional biblical morality, taken in many ways, in some cases to an extreme.
Biblical morality actually stood behind the Balfour Declaration 100 years ago by Lloyd George.
Correct.
Balfour. So,
and the Balfour
changed?
Declaration was the high point of Christian Zionism. From that point, it was downhill all the way. From that point, the Church of England stopped being evangelical Christian Zionist and turned, as it now has become, in the forefront of being anti-Israel. And that is because the churches in America played a very, very different role to the role that they played in Britain. In Britain, the church was not a bulwark against this whole kind of progressive way of thinking. And I think personally that is the difference. Now, the final point is Daniel is absolutely correct that there are people who are so not just entrenched in this point of view, but for whom, as Daniel says, it's part of their moral and political personality, and they cannot allow any deviation at all without that personality fracturing. So those people are lost. They are lost. And how one deals with them is another question. But beyond them, there are millions and millions of people who kind of go along with this kind of way of thinking. They go along with the lies because they don't know their lies. All they know is the kind of oral and visual wallpaper that's coming at them from the BBC, which tells them one story only, that Israel behaves illegally and illegitimately, and that it would all be fine if it wasn't for the settlers and for Benjamin Netanyahu. That's what people hear.
But wasn't that the case 20 years ago when Tony Blair, a dear friend of Israel, was in office?
Sorry, who?
Tony Blair.
Absolutely.
Or Gordon Brown or David
Absolutely.
Cameron in that respect?
Absolutely, and that's because Tony Blair was, in many respects, a very dear friend of Israel, and so was Gordon Brown. But they nevertheless were part of a way of thinking which undermined that basic position in ways which are, we don't have time to go into all of that. So what they were saying was basically ambiguous, and indeed Tony Blair, the great friend of Israel, said over and over and over again, if we can solve the Middle East impasse by a Palestine state, then basically everything's going to be fine. He said that. He saw the Palestine state issue as being the crux of the threats that were facing the Western world. This was barking mad, and he was the great friend of Israel. So to a greater or lesser extent, people on that side of the political argument have bought into a set of fictions, a set of lies, a set of ideas which don't hold water, a set of aspirations which can never be realized, historical ignorance. It's a terrible stew which I believe those people can be got at with the right kind of approach based on here are the facts and you've been being told lies. Some of them are lost, for sure, but a lot of them are not lost, and it's those people I think we should be going for.
No, Amit, I will destroy the party.
Don't rain on our parade.
No, but I think that we are all making ourselves as Israelis and as Jews too many concessions. Because it's very easy to say, London and UK is the hub of anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism. And I think that most of the voices that we hear against Israel is very extreme, is an extreme minority. I think that most of the British people are very good people. And actually, I plan to tell you some other facts, but John shared with me a poll, which is amazing. 4 questions was asked in the general British public. 1, I don't boycott goods or products from Israel and find it difficult to understand why others would single out Israel to boycott given everything else that's going on in the world. 48% of the British people agreed with this saying. Only 11% disagreed, and there is a lot of gray area. And the question is, so for example, you see that half of the British people is supportive for Israel. For example, when you're asking Israel is considered to be the most important British ally in the Middle East. I mean, 49% agree to it, only 18 don't agree to it, and again, there is 30% of a gray area. And about anti-Semitism, we asked the British public whether they agreed with the statement, hating Israel and questioning its right to exist is anti-Semitic. Almost 50% agreed. Now, I understand that, like in any other society, there is people who are anti-Semitic, hate Israel, but the question is, and maybe Daniel will be able to answer on it, is how much Israel is investing, not in education, because it's not our duty to educate the Palestinian people, but in advocating the Israeli case, in explaining our reality, our history, our paranoias. And you know what? I think that most of the Israelis, if you will, or most of the Israeli governments gave up on Europe. We gave up on Europe in a way. If you will ask most of the Israelis, all of the Israelis, who is the biggest ally of Israel? In the good case, most of them will say the US. In the worst case, some of them will say the US Republican Party. But no one will say Europe. And I'm asking myself sometime, why? Okay, because the US alliance with the US is of course highly important to Israel. But Europe is here. We have a joint culture with Europe. We have joint history with Europe. Half of the Israelis came back to Israel from Europe, including my grandmother from Liverpool, if it's considered to be Europe, of course. And when I will ask you, you are a political historiographer, Amit. I will ask you, who is the last prime minister that visited officially, our prime minister giving an annual speech at the UN, at the US Congress? Who was the last prime minister that visited officially in the EU Parliament? Don't say if you know. Do you know?
I'm not sure there was...
Anyone know? Yitzhak Rabin. 22 years ago. The last prime minister that addressed the EU Parliament.
Yes, but
was Yitzhak Rabin. Why?
But you have to take into account the fact that number 2 in your party was almost arrested in London when she arrived there 8 years ago. So I'm not sure. I mean, European capitals are the most convenient scene for
I
Israeli
agree.
politicians to have speeches.
By the way, I agree. But this is, I think, of course, it's the fault of education, it's the fault of anti-Semitic action, it's the fault of a movement like the BDS. But it's also because we, in many, many ways,
No,
gave...
I dined with the former spokesperson of the IDF, who actually came to the UK and stayed in a hotel room under, it was, no, not in your term, I think, yes, in your term, under a pseudonym, I mean, under a different name, in order not to get arrested.
No, I agree with this reality, and it's a reality. The question is, how do we change it, and if it's possible.
Later,
Now,
he
I
got
think,
arrested in Israel, but for others.
I think that it's possible. You know, I mean, I wasn't afraid to go to the European Union. I addressed the European Parliament twice on BDS, on struggle against BDS, on anti-terrorism, okay, on anti-Semitism. I found many, many allies and great friends of Israel all around Europe. Do we, and I'm not the Prime Minister, I think that the government should do more. And by the way, to tell them the truth. And it's not about 2 states or 1 state. I will wrap up with this. You know, people in the UK, a lot of them are good people, and when they're being addressed by the BDS activists, telling them that they want to free Palestine and telling them that they want 2-state solution, we should tell them the truth. The BDS is not pro 2-state solution. The BDS is pro erasing the state of Israel. They should know it. The BDS belong to those who not wish to live here next to us. They belong to those who wish to live here instead of us. And if they will hear it from both right and left in the Israeli parliament, and we will reach our hand and explain it more in Europe, Israel can win Europe, trust me, with not much effort.
So, Ambassador Tao, I would just like to bounce off these ideas to you and ask you, is it only a question of what you call hasbara? It's only the number of interviews we give, only the message box?
You know, if you're an ambassador abroad and you come back to Israel and you meet with the Prime Minister or the Foreign Minister, or in this case it's the same person, and he wants you to summarize what is the situation in the country that you're serving, but he has a limited attention span. And so he expects you to summarize it in half a sentence. And the strange thing is that with the UK, I think you can. I think I managed to get it down in Hebrew into 4 words, which was Hatov mishtaper v'hara midalder. The good is getting better and the bad is getting worse. And that is a fairly accurate description. I think Melanie was absolutely right to highlight the extraordinary cooperation and tributes to David Quarry and all of his team that they've done in terms of trade, technology, security, and so on. But the bad is getting worse. And clearly education is critical, and you only have to scratch the surface of a diplomat or an ex-diplomat, and they will start quoting how pitiful the budget that you have for doing education or hasbara in your embassy is, less than any brand of yogurt that gets launched in Israel, and so on and so forth. And for a strategic issue, it's absolutely critical. But I think it's also important that we understand the threat correctly. And I personally think that we are mistaken if we focus exclusively or even mainly on boycotts in the United Kingdom. The fact is, boycotts are few and far between, and they're relatively easy to counter. You know, I found when I was countering a boycott, whether it was the Tricycle Theatre that wouldn't show Israeli-sponsored films, or when the MP for Bradford East said it was a no-Israel zone and all our embassy went with our passports there, we were met with more appreciation from the citizens of Bradford than George Galloway has. So those explicit boycotts are actually not so difficult to counter. I think the real threat is the passive boycott, the quiet boycott that takes place below the radar screen. The university administration that will not say we don't want to have you because you're an Israeli, but there are security considerations, there are other sensitivities, and they will try and so on and so forth. And there it is totally inexcusable by any standards. These are people that have a responsibility. They are custodians of important intellectual spaces, and they're abnegating that responsibility. And I think that we're not doing sufficient, not just to educate, not just to fight back, but also to hold the custodians, and that includes also broadcasting stations, to custodians of the intellectual spaces. We need to hold them to their task, and that's a crucial aspect that I think we haven't discussed enough here.
dispute that everything went downhill after Balfour. When I said in the 1970s, I think after 1967, there was a shift in Labour Party attitudes. I don't think it went downhill quite as rapidly as that, because the Labour Party has traditionally been a very strong pro-Israeli party, and the evidence that that is still there exists within the Parliamentary Labour Party. Over the last 2 years, since we've faced this appalling open anti-Semitism that there is no excuse for, and I make none, and I would never dream of covering it up. It's there and we have to stand up to it. But during that 2 years, we have trebled our membership in Parliament in Labour Friends of Israel, because other people, other Labour members, want to stand with us in solidarity and say this is not part of Labour Party values or principles, and we will not give that ground now or ever. But I do agree with Melanie about challenging this. I've met with a fantastic organisation called Stand With Us, and they organise on university campuses, and they are brilliant. And we must stand with them. And they find the same thing when they stand up and get students to, and they train and help students and give them a toolkit by which to do it, then other students stand up with them. Because it's impossible to deny the values and principles that underpin combating anti-Semitism, boycotts, however they might manifest themselves. We shouldn't get it out of perspective. I think it is still a minority, but it is a threat in universities. And I think vice-chancellors have abrogated their responsibility and their duty to stand up to this on the basis that it's okay to be left-wing in a university. This isn't being left-wing. There's nothing left-wing about anti-Semitism. It's simply wrong. It's against all kinds of human rights and everything else we believe in about equalities. They have a duty of care to their students, both to those students who feel threatened by anti-Semitism and can't speak their mind, and to those students who are being influenced by it to accept and propagate values that are actually damaging to any notion of equal rights and humanity. So I do think it can be combated. Boycotts are not the biggest issue because trade with Israel is huge. It's grown by almost 2 billion in a few years. That's massive. It's clearly not succeeding. We shouldn't get it out of perspective. If London's the boycott capital, then we're doing all right because we're beating it back. But it does take challenge and it does take leadership, and we must give our young people that. And that's why I say let's work with organisations like Stand With Us, because they give that leadership and we can stand with them.
Unfortunately, we have time only for 1 minute closing remarks. Otherwise, we'll run out of time. So,
can I just say something? I'm listening to other colleagues. I don't want anybody in the room to think that the Conservative Party is entirely perfect in their support for Israel. We have plenty problems and plenty of work to do, and we'll continue to do it. But my last comment is about the often forgotten last sentence of the Balfour Declaration. Everyone talks about the two parts, and Melanie talked about that and gave her view. The last line talks about the rights of the Jewish community and the Jewish people in other countries. That's the last line of Balfour. And as I have said before, and I'll continue to say it, in 1948 there were refugees that were created here in this area. We call them Palestinians, maybe some 700,000 or whatever the exact number, at that very same conflict, and because of the very same creation of the State of Israel, there were about 850,000 Jews of Arab lands who should not be forgotten. Only a few years after the Holocaust, left their homes, had to leave their homes with only the clothes that they were wearing, leaving their businesses behind. And let me tell you and remind you, there have been about 170 UN resolutions about the Palestinians. There have been 13 UN organizations for the Palestinians. There have been tens of millions, probably billions of dollars spent on the Palestinians. And what has been spent on and supported for the Jews of Arab land? Nada. Nothing. And I don't think that should be forgotten from the 67 words of the Balfour Declaration.
I would just like to say in conclusion that the Balfour Declaration was the point at which the fate of the British and the fate of the Jewish people came into perfect alignment. I would like to see a situation now where that situation can be renewed, where once again the British people can be made to understand, brought to understand, that their fate and their best chances of defending the values that they hold dear are in complete alignment with those of the State of Israel, and that Britain and Israel should form that alliance of decency, standing up mutually for a shared understanding of the rule of law, of freedom, of democracy, of justice, and a proper appreciation of history and of truth.
In the 30 seconds that you gave me, I will tell you, I'm leading the two-state solution caucus at the Knesset, and I'm from those who are investigating our enemies. I'm talking with them. But I always make a differentiation between two kinds of enemies. There is those who want to live here next to us, and those who want to live here instead of us. This is the differentiation that I'm doing. Now, with those who want to live here instead of us, and the only way to talk with is our brave soldiers of the IDF. To those who want to live here instead of us, we should make it very, very clear, it will never ever happen. Israel is here to stay, period. But we do have an obligation to speak with all those who at least say that they understand that we're here to stay, and they're willing to live here next to us. And these enemies can be our enemies in the region, they can be the Palestinian, and they can be those who hate us or demonize us in the UK. And I would love for us in Israel to make more effort on it, to not give up on Europe or in the UK, because as I found it, we have a lot of allies in the UK from both sides of the aisle. And by the way, it's also a good thing, a good opportunity for me as the chair of the friendship group to thank both of you for doing so much for Israel and the parliament of your country.
That was an eye-opener for us. Unfortunately, we have to end this discussion. So thank you very much, Ambassador Tao, the Right Honorable Ryan, the Right Honorable Bar. This is an opportunity to say the words for Knesset member. Yeah, exactly. Lord Pollack and Ms. Phillips, thank you so much.